Instead of war on poverty, they got a war on drugs so the police can bother me.
Those are the words of Tupac. Words written in the 1990s, by the way. You know, you don't need a master's degree in history to see the plan was never justice. It was control. Because let's be honest, when powdered cocaine was flowing through Wall Street and yacht parties, it was a health crisis. But when crack hit the hood, suddenly it was a war. A war where 3.5 grams of crack magically became 350 grams in the eyes of the law. A war where poor black men were handed life sentences for one rock while white CEOs snorted whole lines with a slap on the wrist. This isn't a conspiracy theory. It's an American policy. And it didn't start in the shadows. It started in broad daylight, under presidents who wore suits and smiled while signing bills that torched entire communities. This episode, we're not just talking about drugs. We're talking about the systemic, state-sponsored, racially targeted sabotage that was gift-wrapped in legislation backed by police and televised like a crime drama. This is the real war on drugs. And it was never about drugs at all. Imagine this. You're caught with 3.5 grams of crack cocaine. That's less than a teaspoon of sugar. But somehow, when the government tallies it up in court, that 3.5 turns into 350 grams. A legal illusion that puts you behind bars as if you were a kingpin moving kilos across state lines. This wasn't a glitch in the system. It was the system. In 1986, Congress passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act. It introduced the infamous 100-to-1 sentencing disparity. 5 grams of crack cocaine triggered the same mandatory minimum sentence as 500 grams of powdered cocaine. Let me repeat that. 500 grams. That's over a pound. Why? Because crack was flooding poor, urban, mostly black neighborhoods, while powder cocaine stayed nestled in the nostrils of the suburban elite. It was never about the chemistry. Crack and powder are chemically nearly identical. It was about perception. It was about who was holding it. So if you're poor and black with a few grams of crack, suddenly you're a trafficker. You're slapped with a sentence meant for a cartel boss. And guess what that did for entire generations? Families shattered, fathers vanished, kids raised by systems that were designed to fail them. Schools couldn't teach what the state was legally preaching. You're guilty by design. All under the banner of justice. If that ain't cooked math, I don't know what the hell is. You want to talk about irony? While the U.S. government was locking up black teens for pocketfuls of crack, they were moving bricks behind the scene. Enter the Iran-Contra affair in the 1980s. See, the CIA needed money to fund anti-communist rebels, the Contras, in Nicaragua. But Congress had already said no to that funding. So what do the good patriots do when they can't get their money legally? Simple. They sell drugs. Yep. The CIA looked the other way while cocaine flooded into Los Angeles through Nicaraguan traffickers. The operation funded America's favorite Central American freedom fighters and started an epidemic that would devastate black neighborhoods for decades. For telling the truth, Webb was ridiculed by mainstream outlets and later died under mysterious circumstances from 2 gunshot wounds to the head. Ruled a suicide because, of course, it was. Tell me, how can you shoot yourself twice in the head? Let's put it like this. While poor black kids were getting 20 years for a dime bag, Uncle Sam was ghostwriting the recipe for destruction and cooking it in the same neighborhoods. As Tupac said,
Work, ship them, don't let them deal with brothers. Give them guns, step back, watch them kill each other.
and they did. Not because they were broken people, but because they were set up. Because their communities were under siege from policies wearing the face of patriotism and the badge of the law. Let's just say the quiet part out loud. The war on drugs was never about public safety. It was about control. Control over who gets locked up, where money gets funneled, and how political power stays in the hands of those already holding the remote. In 1994, John Ehrlichman, Nixon's former domestic policy chief, admitted it. He said, and I quote, "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities." So let's stop pretending this war was ever noble. It was an excuse to militarize police, flood black and brown neighborhoods with surveillance, and stack prison beds like dominoes. And what did that accomplish? A booming private prison industry, a generational cycle of incarceration and poverty, and a government that used fear as fuel to stay in power. Meanwhile, crack got a 100-to-1 sentencing disparity compared to powdered cocaine. Why? Because one form was used by poor black folks and the other was used by white executives in corner offices.
Give them guns, step back, watch them kill each other.
Tupac again. The war wasn't on drugs. It was on black families. It was on resistance. It was on truth. And every law, every bust, every just say no campaign was just another brick in a prison wall we were never meant to climb over. The crack epidemic didn't just ruin lives, it reconstructed them. Fathers disappeared behind bars, mothers took on triple roles, caregiver, breadwinner, and trauma sponge. Kids raised themselves or each other while the government looked on and called it justice. Entire neighborhoods were gutted, not by drugs, but by mandatory minimums, no-knock raids, and 3-strike laws that hit hardest where resources were already lowest. And yet, families were being torn apart. Corporate America was cashing in. Big Pharma stepped in with a prescription pad. The suburbs became the new battlefield. And suddenly addiction became a public health crisis instead of a moral failure. Why? Because the new face of addiction was white. We saw methadone clinics, rehab centers, and sympathy instead of cell blocks, court dates, and caution tape. But no, they took the pain, wrapped it in policy, and called it protection. And the worst part? Many of those who created this epidemic, whether by turning a blind eye or feeding the fire, are still in power. And still unapologetic. It's time to stop acting like this was a mistake. It was deliberate, and now we get to expose it. Here's the uncomfortable truth. We don't fix generational damage with a hashtag. We fix it with money, policy, and accountability. Start with reparations, not just as cash, but as access. Fund historically excluded communities. Cancel criminal records tied to nonviolent drug offenses. Create real mental health infrastructure run by the community, not by contractors with cousins on Capitol Hill. And about reform, miss us with the performative nonsense. We don't need more listening sessions. We need systemic rewrites, end mandatory minimums, abolish private prisons, stop punishing poverty and calling it order. Because if the war on drugs was ever real, it was never about safety. It was about control. It was about power. And it was about the profit of a system built on Black suffering. They didn't want a solution. They wanted a statistic. And now that the numbers have names, faces, and stories, it's time to flip their table. You know what's wild? Crack was a crisis. Meth was a headline. But opioids, that was a tragedy. 3 drug epidemics, same streets, same bodies. Only difference? Who the system decided was worth saving. So if you're wondering why we're still screaming, still marching, still recording these stories like our lives depend on it, it's because they do. Victor Perez, Breonna Taylor, Khalif Browder. Tupac wasn't writing poetry. He was writing prophecy. So no, this isn't just another episode. This is a digital reckoning, a spoken word body cam. And if you think that's dramatic, good. Because we've tried silence. We've tried being polite. We've tried letting the system work it out. Now it's our turn. And every policymaker, pundit, preacher, and pocket-stuffing politician who still thinks you can play God with other people's pain, I've got 4 words for you. Not on our watch. Before this episode comes to a close, let's send this out to the genius of Tupac Shakur, a prophet in rhyme. 29 years after his death, his words still echo the same painful truths we uncovered tonight. That's not nostalgia, it's prophecy. A prophecy written over 30 years ago. So rest easy, Pac. We heard you. We're still listening, and we're still fighting. Coming up next on Uncovered Badger Burden, we're headed to Walker County, Alabama, where Sheriff Nick Smith was recently indicted for hiring uncertified deputies, one with a violent past, and a department surveilled for the 2023 death of a mentally ill inmate. 14 staff members are already facing federal charges, and now legal cracks are forming in the walls of small-town policing. A sheriff here isn't just under pressure, he may be criminally liable. And it's a stark reminder, when local law enforcement goes unchecked, real power becomes real corruption. Until next time, I'm Kyle Fields. Good night.